20-year-old Singaporean woman Matilda climbed Gunung Kinabalu, reaching 4,095 meters in just 2 days. Now, in fact, it's less than 2 days. She started off on a Friday morning, rested at Laban Rata in the afternoon, and summited at dawn on Saturday. Now, that's less than 24 hours. A year later, she scoffed at the Annapura base camp trek itinerary, which planned to reach base camp in 6 days. Thinking that she could do it like Kinabalu, she marched on ahead of everyone else. When she hit the 4,000 meter mark, she had a splitting headache and was unable to go any further. She couldn't understand it. She had no problems on the summit of Kinabalu, and Annapura base camp is only 4,130 meters, just marginally higher than Kinabalu. Why? Allow me to explain in the following video. Hi guys, welcome to Traveler's Tales by Hunkle Chan. In this video, I'm going to touch on a timeless topic and it's also one of my pet topics. Holidays at altitude. How to survive and have fun on a trip into thin air. Acute mountain sickness, AMS. Those of you who have never experienced it may find it a bit difficult to imagine what it's like. But many first-time high-altitude tourists can be in for a nasty surprise when they arrive at a destination that is considerably higher than sea level. Our lovely model Matilda has already shown us what it looks like. Now, most people, after ascending quickly to 3,000 meters, will feel some headache, loss of appetite, and difficulty falling asleep. Now, these are usually the first symptoms of AMS. Now, if you ignore those symptoms and ascend quickly to a higher altitude, your symptoms may get worse. A headache gets more intense. You can have nausea or vomiting, breathlessness, and a lack of energy. If you ignore those symptoms and continue to climb quickly, you may end up coughing, wheezing, and walking like you're drunk. Now, what's happening is that fluid is getting into the lungs and the brain. They are swelling. In the former situation, it's called high altitude pulmonary edema, HAPE, and in the latter case, it's called high altitude cerebral edema, or HACE. These two conditions are life-threatening, and the victim can collapse and die. We can see that high-altitude tourism has its risks, but it's also not so risky. Now, what do I mean by that? Yes, there is a possibility of dying from AMS, but that happens when people refuse to listen to their bodies. You get moderate symptoms when you ignore the mild symptoms, and you get severe, life-threatening symptoms when you ignore the moderate symptoms. It's progressive and it doesn't kill you suddenly and immediately at the very beginning. That's how Matilda managed to reach 4,000 meters in less than 24 hours. AMS takes time to get you. Like most climbers, she was able to tolerate the climb to Laban Rata at 3,272 meters. Within hours, she did a hit and run on Kinabalu's 4,095 meter summit. She might have liked to think that she had conquered Kinabalu, but she had merely survived a hit and run on the summit. And she was probably soaking her feet at pouring hot springs before the clutches of AMS reached her. Similarly, if she had taken a cable car up to Yulong Xueshan and descended to Li Jiang fast enough, she might be able to escape AMS as well. Imagine yourself running to the edge of a cliff and then turning back before falling off. That's how people get away with it. It's a different situation in the Annapura Himal. Matilda climbed high and stayed high If she had moved too quickly towards 4,000 meters without being able to turn back and descend to a significantly lower altitude fast enough, she would have been susceptible to AMS. Alpinists are super fit people who are able to launch a quick hit and run on the summit without being acclimatized in stages in progressive camps towards the summit. However, it's a risky strategy. If the weather turns bad and they are trapped high up on the mountain, they become extremely vulnerable. On one of my many climbs on Mount Kinabalu, I saw a dead body being brought down. It's not a climber, but a worker from the lowlands who had just started to work at high altitude. Unlike the climbers, he wasn't doing a hit and run. He stayed and worked at high altitude and succumbed to it. Nowadays, pulse oximeters cost less than $20, and there is no excuse not to have one when you're walking into thin air. Now, in order to know how to manage thin air, you've got to understand the physics and the physiology behind AMS. Don't worry about the jargon and terminology. I'll present it to you in bite-sized pieces. Now, the first thing you ought to know is you're an intruder when you enter thin air. The landscape is beautiful, but the environment is hostile and it doesn't like you. A bit like Matilda's father, me. Now, that's because your normal habitat is at the bottom of an ocean. That would be an ocean of air. Imagine you're sitting at the bottom of the ocean like Matilda here, and you have the weight of an entire ocean pressing down on you. We learned in science that air has no fixed volume. It fills up any container. The distance between the molecules is determined by the pressure at the bottom of the ocean of air. In other words, at sea level, the pressure is relatively high. The molecules are relatively close to one another at a pressure of 1 atmosphere. Now, climbing up to a higher altitude is like swimming to the surface of this ocean of air. The closer you are to the surface of this ocean of air, the lower the pressure is. When the pressure is lower, the molecules are further apart. That's why we call it thin air. The composition of air at sea level and in the Himalayas are exactly the same, about 20% oxygen. However, due to the lower pressure at high altitude, the oxygen molecules are further apart. With each breath you take in, fewer molecules of oxygen enter your blood, and you start to feel the effects. So, how are some folks able to climb to the summits of Himalayan peaks? Why are some seemingly frail individuals able to visit high-altitude tourist spots? The answer is gradual climb and acclimatization. Now, what is acclimatization? When the body is exposed to thin air, the lack of oxygen will stimulate the kidneys to release a protein called erythropoietin. Now, this hormone, in turn, stimulates the stem cells in our bone marrow to transform into red blood cells. With more red blood cells per unit volume, the blood is able to carry more oxygen and the symptoms of AMS are alleviated. Progressive exposure to high altitude over a period of time is the only reliable way to reach high altitude destinations. Every responsible guide or trip leader should ensure that the team has adequate time to acclimatize before pushing higher. Of course, not everyone acclimatizes at the same speed, and when you have a big group, you'll see a bell-shaped curve with people at the slow end struggling to keep up with the majority. Well, as Singaporeans, we know how precious our leave is. Apart from retirees and those in between jobs, telling the boss that you're spending 16 days in the Himalayas can be a bit tough. As a veteran to high places, many people have asked me tricks and tips for acclimatization shortcuts on high altitude treks. But nowadays, the youngsters would rather listen to the young and nubile influencers like Matilda. In this video, I hope to be able to share some of my insights and experience on trips into thin air. Now, how do we shortcut the acclimatization process? Some people may think that they could acclimatize by sleeping on top of Bukit Timah, Cameron Highlands or Mount Bromo. It doesn't work that way. Why? Because even if you ascend to a higher altitude and the pressure decreases, your blood pigment, hemoglobin, is still able to bind and carry oxygen just as it would at sea level, up to a certain threshold. Now imagine a tug of war between two evenly matched teams. Nothing much happens at first until a certain threshold is reached. To understand that, we'll need to look at the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. Now, this is a normal curve that you get. For our purposes, we need to flip over with the percentage saturation as vertical axis and the ascending altitude as horizontal axis. Notice that the hemoglobin seems to be unaffected by decreasing pressure until a certain threshold is reached. Airlines take advantage of this characteristic of hemoglobin and maintain cabin pressure not at sea level but at 2,000 meters when flying at 10,000 meters. It's far safer and less costly to do that than to pressurize the cabin to sea level. Nevertheless, there is still a huge differential, and when there's a crack in the aircraft, things still burst out. Theoretically, cabin attendants should be marginally acclimatized to high altitude. In reality, we can only significantly acclimatize when we are exposed to an altitude above 3,000 meters. If you take a look at the standard Everest base camp trek itinerary, you'll see an acclimatization day after reaching Namche Bazaar at 3,440 meters, and another acclimatization day at Dingbo Che or Peri Che, 4,200 to 4,300 meters. Now, these rest days are very important in that they give a bit of time for the red blood cells to mature. It normally takes about 2 weeks. So note that you will never fully acclimatize in the 1 week period between Namche Bazaar and Everest Base Camp. You can only reach a level just sufficient to prevent dangerous AMS. Of course, a bell-shaped curve applies to this general rule. People like me have no issues with an itinerary even shorter than this, but there will be some lowlanders who acclimatize much slower than others. I once saw a young man who was throwing up and unable to stand straight at Pendant Hut on Mount Kinabalu, 3,289 meters. He was one of those at one end of the bell-shaped curve, very prone to AMS. Even when you are not that prone to AMS, most kiasu, kiasi and busy Singaporeans would want a way to get around these issues. Straight away, Diamox comes to mind. And here's where the community cannot be more divided. Some people will tell you that Diamox masks AMS symptoms and you can suddenly collapse from AMS without knowing that you have it. Some people say that you shouldn't even take painkillers for your headache. And some people will tell you that Diamox is a must for lowlanders like us. The truth lies somewhere in between. Diamox, generically known as acetazolamide, belongs to a class of drugs called carbonic anhydrase inhibitors. Now in English, it helps the body keep carbon dioxide within the body so as to maintain blood pH. We normally look at carbon dioxide as a waste product, but it actually has a very important function of maintaining pH in the body. When we lowlanders first encounter thin air at 3,000 meters, we tend to hyperventilate, and in so doing, we lose carbon dioxide and our blood becomes alkaline. A change in blood pH is what causes headaches and loss of appetite. Taking a painkiller like Ponstan or mefenamic acid is not only harmless but actually beneficial as long as you don't have any contraindications back home. Now, studies have shown that acidic foods like garlic and citrus fruits have a positive effect at high altitude. Apart from maintaining the pH of your blood, Diamox has another function, and that is it thickens your blood. How does it do that? By making you urinate more. It's what we call a diuretic. Blood is made up of cells and plasma. When the cells are filtered and plasma component is processed in the kidneys and excreted as urine, the red blood cell count per unit volume of blood is increased, mimicking acclimatization. In true acclimatization, the body increases red blood cell count per unit volume by producing more red blood cells. Diamox does that by making you lose water. You can call it cheating, but nobody said you can't do it. The proper use of Diamox is for comfortable acclimatization. It's not for you to chiong all the way without acclimatization. For instance, our young man who was already sick at 3,000 plus meters on Mount Kinabalu might have been helped by Diamox. Not that he can make the summit like everyone else on the next day, but he can probably acclimatize more comfortably for a couple of days at 3,000 meters before making a summit bid. For those who don't have much symptoms at Namche Bazaar, it's not necessary to take Diamox. There's no fun if you have to keep running to the toilet for nothing. Now, if you have the luxury of a personal guide and lots of time to spare, those who are prone to AMS can try doing the Everest trek in 18 days instead of 14 days. Now, some years ago, when Korean President Park Geun-hye was investigated for bribery, abuse of power, and leaking government secrets, Viagra was found in her possession. Now, the explanation was that it's used for managing AMS. Like everybody, I was going like, yeah, right. But 2 years ago, when I was trekking in Kyrgyzstan with a retired Korean professor, I found that he was taking generic Viagra or sildenafil to prevent AMS. He told me that there is research data to show that sildenafil can alleviate symptoms of AMS. And he was right. The drug is capable of opening up blood vessels in the lungs and increase oxygen uptake. It works for both males and females. Do consult your doctor before taking. Now, what about non-drug supplements? I've been taking a combo of ginkgo extract and vitamin B for the longest time. There is some data for ginkgo, but not for vitamin B. Anecdotally, it works for me. What about TCM products? Hong Jing Tian comes to mind. There are some somewhat unreliable studies out there, and from personal experience, the claims just don't hold up. The product I used was packed in Singapore, so it should be quite legit. More reliable is a concoction of red ginseng, mai dong, and wu wei zi. Now, going by TCM theory, it should work, but I haven't tried it myself because it would be too troublesome to brew that on the go. Now, one herbal supplement which I've tried is Tongkat Ali. Subjectively, the effect on exercise endurance is significant, but the effect on altitude tolerance is probably not. One stamina improving supplement that I find to be just as effective as cordyceps is citrulline. You can try that. The brand is important. Food supplements are not legally required to get the dosage correct. Find out what works for you. A small disclaimer here. I've not had AMS for a long time, even though I've been trekking above 5,000 meters. Something must be working, but I'm the only guinea pig and I only speak for myself. There are no control subjects. Next, I'll touch a bit on pre-trip acclimatization. There are actually a few gadgets on the market. The most convenient is the altitude tent. Air is treated by one of these generators to remove oxygen, and they can be fitted to the tents to simulate sleeping at high altitude. The generators are very expensive and may not be worth your investment. The obvious danger here is that if something goes wrong, you're going to sleep right through it. There are also masks that can be fitted to low oxygen generators. The advantage is that you remove the mask when something is not right, and you can also monitor your SpO2 with a pulse oximeter. Now here's something I designed myself, but I won't share too much and won't let anyone use it. Not because I'm selfish, but because I don't want to be a lightning rod for haters. Now, some people simulate exercise at high altitude. I don't recommend that because the rationale is to prevent AMS and not trigger it. Hypoxic treatment should be done at rest, in my opinion. I'm currently working on a few other designs for gadgets that will help lowlanders enjoy trips into thin air. Watch this channel.